Okay, welcome to the Explore Lakes with New Hampshire Lakes webinar series. Thank you all so much for joining us. I know it's a beautiful evening, so we do appreciate those of you who are tuning in. Tonight we are going to have a great presentation from Amy Smagula, one of our favorites to have here, with some great information about different lake plants that you see this time of year. I do want to just give a little plug to our next webinar that we're going to be having in October. After tonight, we are going to be switching to a quarterly webinar series, or having webinars as they seem necessary for what might be going on. So the next one that we have scheduled is in October. That's the State of Lake Health and Advocacy in New Hampshire. That'll be great with our own Andrea Lamoureux, our president, and Michelle Farnham, our advocacy and policy program manager. So make sure to tune into that. The registration is open on our website. Let's see. Okay. So just a few housekeeping tips. We are going to record this, as you might have seen in the chat box, as we usually do. And that recording will be available for all of you to see on our website tomorrow, and on our YouTube page. So you can share it with friends or go back and check the slides. Those will be available as well in a PDF form. We do ask that you stay muted for the duration of the webinar, just to help cut back on background noise, and keep your cameras turned off. That helps with distraction as well as our bandwidth, in case we're having any issues with that during the program. If you have any questions for Amy while she's presenting, do please go ahead and put those in the chat box. If our team is able to answer them right then and there, we will go ahead and do that, but we'll most likely leave those questions for Amy, our expert, at the end. And we will try to get to as many of them as possible before we have to stop at 8 o'clock. And tomorrow you're going to receive an evaluation form from us. Please do give us your feedback. We love to hear it. We want to know what you guys want to see in our upcoming webinars, what we could maybe be doing better, what you liked, what you didn't like. And that's where you'll also get notification that the recording has been posted. And just a quick little background about us, if you're not familiar with us, we're the only publicly supported nonprofit in New Hampshire working for all of our lakes, which is almost 1,000. Sort of hard to believe. I didn't know that before I started working here. And you can support our lakes and help keep them clean and healthy right on our website at nhlakes.org. We certainly appreciate those donations, and so do our lakes. Our mission is to restore and preserve the health of New Hampshire's lakes. As we all know, we're seeing more and more cyanobacteria blooms and aquatic invasive species, which I'm sure Amy will talk about a little bit this evening. So they do need our help. We are all responsible to keep them nice and clean and available for all of our future generations. And at New Hampshire Lakes, we're trying to do that through our 3 program areas. We have our advocacy program. Michelle is starting a great new initiative. So if you're interested in our advocacy work, do please reach out to her, get involved. You know, we're coming up on a midterm, and it's will be a lot going on at the State House. We have our conservation program, which is in full swing this time of year. Our whole conservation team is busy out in the field. We have our Lake Host program, stopping the spread of aquatic invasive species, and our Lake Smart program. Our team is out visiting lots of properties, giving great tips to homeowners of things that they could be doing to improve their properties to be more lake friendly. And then we have our outreach program, which is bringing you our webinar series tonight. We also do great programs like our Lakes Congress, which we have at the beginning of the summer, and all of our other fun outreach things that we do for the public. Our host this evening, I'm Erin Mastheim. I'm the outreach coordinator here at New Hampshire Lakes, and Gloria Norcross is joining us to help man the chat box. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Amy to get to the good stuff. She is a limnologist and exotic species program coordinator, and in the Watershed Management Bureau in the Water Division of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And with that, Amy, I will go ahead and stop sharing and hand it over to you.
All right, that sounds good. Let me just try to transition here. Hello, everyone. I see lots of familiar names and faces, so welcome and thank you for joining. You should hopefully be able to see my screen.
Yes.
Great. And I'll just make that bigger. And like Erin said, I'm gonna just take my video off so that I don't eat up too much bandwidth. I have a lot of photos in the slideshow, so I'm going to turn that off and we should be good to go. So yeah, as Erin said, I'm going to talk about lake plants, which a lot of you hear me talking about often, but this is a slightly different slant. And Erin and I collaborated on putting the talk together in terms of the title and what to include. And this is a little different than I normally do. I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful when it comes to aquatic plants that are in your lakes and your ponds and in some rivers as well. So as I go through, let's see if I can get this to advance. There we go. So the overview of the talk is that I'm going to go through each of these categories and talk about some of the plants that we don't normally talk about when it comes to aquatic plants in lakes and ponds. The good does definitely include native plants, but I'm going to talk about some of those that are more on the spectrum of rare, threatened, and endangered species. The bad, of course, are the invasive, so I will give you an overview of those. I'm going to actually include a lot more than I normally do. I usually focus in a lot on milfoils and fanwort and water chestnut, but there are a lot of other ones that are on our radar, and they're actually prohibited in New Hampshire. And the reason why I want to hone in on that is because with climate change and with people starting to move around more frequently, excuse me, we may start to see some of these plants coming in and sneaking their way into a lake or pond near us. Oops. The next category is a little bit different. I don't know that I'm going to use the term ugly throughout, but are there ugly plants out there? That sort of is subjective, I think, but let's see. I've got some interesting looking plants that I'll share with you. And then of course, I'll share some of the beautiful ones that are out there. And for this, I think what I'm going to do is focus more in on those colorful ones. A lot of times when we see aquatic plants, we see these really green plants that don't have a lot of showy flowers. Aquatic plants don't typically need to have really pretty, bright, colorful flowers because they reproduce mostly by vegetative reproduction, where pieces of the plant break off and generate into a new plant. So they don't need to look really pretty to do that. So they don't need to have pretty flowers to attract pollinators. But we do have a lot of color around our lakes and ponds. So I will share some slides on that as well. So diving right into the good plants, a lot of times I get asked the question while I'm working with lakes, are there good plants? Are these plants in our lake bad? Or are any of them good? And that is sort of subjective. I know that the tendency is for a lot of people to think of lakes as these nice sandy bottomed, clean, clear, deep basins. But that's not the reality when it comes to most of our lakes. In fact, only about a quarter of our lakes fall into that category of super clear, deep, few plants, and really rocky or sandy bottoms. Most of our lakes tend to fall sort of into the category of a little bit of muck and organic material on the lake bottom, a dozen or 24 different types of plants in the lake, and a mix of open habitat and plant growth. And then we do have a small percentage of our lakes that are very weedy across the entire surface. And those are, a little bit more wetland-like. And now I'm not even talking about invasive plants. So I'm just talking about natives that we have in our system. So let's look at a definition of native. What we look at in New Hampshire for a native species is a species that has evolved over time or it's developed in a particular area. usually before European colonization. And that's sort of the benchmark that we use, because when people started arriving by ship a couple hundred years ago, or before that, actually, several hundred years ago, they brought with them plants and seeds and products that had contaminants of seeds in them. And they started bringing those into the New World, where they started colonizing. So we started having this influx of all these different species that typically weren't here on this continent. So that could either be a purposeful or an accidental introduction by them. So we use the benchmark of prior to European colonization for when our native plants are categorized as actually native. And a little bit beyond that, the state's Natural Heritage Bureau, and they're housed under the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, and that is under the Division of Forests and Lands, actually has statutes that relate to native plant protection. And under the RSA that I showed here, the staff at that agency are responsible for protecting and conserving native plants. And that does include plants that are on land as well as in the water. So there is an act that does cover native plants. So a lot of times when people ask, well, can I rake out the plants that are in front of my house in the lake bed, or can I cut the bushes that are growing in front of my house? Those are actually, in fact, protected in the state. And that's why raking, digging, dredging plants out, or removing shoreline vegetation is all, those are all activities that require permits, because these are protected plants. And in fact, many of you with shorefront property probably had to get a Natural Heritage Bureau review before you put a dock in or before you put a structure in, just to see if there were any rare plants in your area or in the plot of land that you were developing. And all of these are cataloged in a database, and we have an idea of where they are in the state, or at least Natural Heritage does. So taking that a little bit deeper, one of the really neat things that Natural Heritage Bureau does is they track the rare, threatened, and endangered plants in New Hampshire. And we do have a number of endangered aquatic plants. You can see the list here. A lot of these are pond weeds or some bladderworts and some other species that are sort of nondescript when you find them in a water body, but they are endangered. So we try to protect them. So we actually have 26 of those in New Hampshire. One of them is showcased here. This is featherfoil. And I'm going to revisit that one in a few slides and call it out a little bit more. But some of you do have some of these plants in your lake. I know for a fact, Lake Massasecum in Bradford has this one right here. It's Sclerolepis uniflora. That its pink bog button is the common name. And that's the only lake in New Hampshire that it's present in. And the only other location near us is in Massachusetts. And it's at the northern extent of its range. So that sort of calls out why some of these plants are endangered. They're either at the northern extent of their range. New Hampshire might not have a characteristic like pH or some other element that really makes that plant survive well. It's barely holding on here. So it is something that we are trying to protect and just try to preserve it as much as we can in our state. We also have a few threatened plants. These are not as critically endangered as the endangered species list, but these are under a special category of protection. And as you can see, we've got some bladderworts on here, some burr reeds, and arrowheads and pond weeds. And these are all plants that have cousins or sister plants that are really not threatened in the state. Almost every lake I ever go to has bladderworts in it and pond weeds in it, but every family of plants just has, maybe one or two that are actually threatened or endangered within them. So those are making these lists. So if you're interested in what might be rare or endangered, the Natural Heritage Bureau has a lot of these species broken down by town. So you can visit town lists and see if any of these rare plants are in aquatic systems near you, even your own lake that you live on. So it's a good way to just be aware of what's going on And if there are any neat plants that you might be out there looking for, a lot of you are weed watchers or volunteer monitors. So this is just another element to think about in terms of your lake or pond and what you might have in it that you might want to protect, that you may not ever know was there. So of course, now we're going to move into the bad plants. These are the invasives. So by definition, and this is a federal level definition, invasive plants are those species that aren't native and that they can cause economic harm, ecological harm, and harm to human health. Economic harm could be harm to some type of food crop or specific use or functional value of the water body. Like recreation might have to be closed off, or the water body needs to be quarantined, or your property values could be affected. So economic harm can be categorized in any of those realms. Ecological harm could be harm to aquatic life, like fish or insects or other plants. Ecological harm also includes the fact that an invasive species could outcompete or crowd out one of those rare, threatened, or endangered plants that I just talked about. And then harm to human health is a lot of times it could be drowning, where you go into really dense beds of invasive plants, you become entangled and you can drown. That's happened in some places. And sometimes some of these plants can potentially be toxic to humans because they emit something, a chemical that you touch it and it can be harmful. You ingest it, it could be harmful. So those are the categories that tie in with a non-native plant that make it invasive. And I just want to point out that not all non-native species are invasive. We have a lot of non-native crop species that we cultivate that are important to us for food or fuel or something else. So not all natives are bad. It's just the non-natives are bad. Just the non-natives that have those characteristics I just went through. So I'm not sure if you mentioned this because, like I said, I always talk about milfoil or fanwort or one of the other poster children for invasive species in New Hampshire. But New Hampshire does have 29 aquatic plants that we have listed as prohibited because they are or they have the potential to be problem children in New Hampshire. And that is a list that we maintain and rule. So it is an official list. And a lot of the activities that are prohibited related to this list are the sale, the purchase, the growing. So a lot of these could be in the nursery trade. It also relates to the transport and the introduction of these species. And for those of you who live on lakes and ponds, that really means a lot when it comes to the transient boater moving these species around and potentially introducing them into your water body. So that's why the Lake Coast program exists, to protect your lakes, but there's also laws behind the work of the Lake Coast program because a lot of these plants are prohibited for movement. So we try to enforce that as best we can. So the next couple of slides are going to be really busy, but I just wanted to take that list of 29 species and give them a face because a lot of times we don't talk about them. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to talk about the emergent plants. So these are the plants that are rooted, that have plant material above the surface of the water. And I'm just going to go through these and point out the different plants that are on here. I'm going to start up at the top left here. And I don't want any of you to freak out because we have a lot of arrowheads that are very native to our lakes and ponds. Most of you have arrowhead around your shoreline areas. These two arrowheads, the giant arrowhead and then the double flowering arrowhead that are shown here, are just really big. They're much bigger than the normal arrowheads that we have that are about a foot tall. These are, probably double that. The leaves are bigger. As you can see in the second photo to the right, the flowers are a lot bigger. These are more like cotton ball size as opposed to tiny little flowers. So we have a couple arrowheads that we list. These are popular in the aquarium trade because people plant these in their home water gardens. So they are, or they were commercially sold in New Hampshire, but they are prohibited. The next one over in the middle is common reed. This one might be a familiar one to many of you who travel our highways in New Hampshire. We definitely have some of this along Route 101, definitely along Route 89. There are a couple of patches along Route 93. And then there are some lakes in the state that have had this actually growing along the shoreline. And then in some, I saw somebody here from Pawtuckaway Lake, it was actually growing in the lake because it crossed under a culvert and found its way into the lake and then started developing in those areas. So common reed is another one that is worrisome. It's a very tall plant. It grows 10 to 15 feet tall. And in August, it is August already, wow. So you're gonna start to see these big brown seed heads forming, and then those will persist into the fall. So the common reed is already here. I just want to point out the arrowheads. I'm not aware of any of these invasive arrowheads in New Hampshire yet. Water fern. This one sort of looks like a four-leaf clover on these long stalks that stick above the water. This one's not in New Hampshire yet. It can form a really dense underwater growth, and then a lot of these plants will stick up above the surface. Coming down here in the middle on the left, flowering rush. This is in a couple spots along the Connecticut River on the New Hampshire border. That's the only location that I know of it in New Hampshire at this point. It is a problem in some spots in Vermont where it forms some thick stands, but it has these little pale pink flowers on it on top of a tall stalk. The next few, the hairy willow herb, dwarf cattail, water spinach, and reed sweetgrass, I'm not aware of in New Hampshire yet. Those are all on our watch list. Also, again, they're popular in the aquarium trade, home water garden trade. The water spinach is actually a federally listed species as being prohibited. It's a food source, and people were selling it as a food source. So it is illegal. And then coming down here across the bottom, purple loosestrife. This one has been around for a while, and I've talked about it quite a bit. If you look around now, you're more than likely going to see purple loosestrife in flower. So these bright purple flower stalks are out, and the plants produce a lot of seed, up to 2.5 million seeds per plant. So they can be very widespread and prolific as a result. This is definitely along highways and some wetland areas right now. You're not likely going to see it in the lake. A lot of these are lake edge issues. Yellow iris. This isn't the same yellow iris that you have growing in your upland water garden. It's definitely along the water's edge. And if you were to have a close-up of this plant, you would see purple sort of veining on the petals of the leaves. So the purple veining is distinctive of the invasive aquatic yellow iris. The native irises don't have the purple veining. And then the next three here, I'm sorry, I should say the yellow iris is in New Hampshire. The next three are not, but they are species that could be sold in the water garden or home aquarium trade. Water forget-me-not. Mini cattail is just what it sounds like. It's got tiny little brown cattails on it as opposed to the big sausage or cigar-shaped ones. And then the stone crop is this little low growing plant. It's sort of a creeper that's down low in marshy soils. So those are your emergent invasives. We don't have, oops, this one is in the wrong spot. We don't have a lot of floating invasive plants in New Hampshire. We're going to ignore the African oxygen weed right now because that is not a floater. The plant right here is floating heart, yellow floating heart. In New Hampshire, we have white floating heart. It's different. The flowers are much smaller, and the leaves of the native floating heart are not very succulent, or they kind of feel puffy if you squeeze them between your fingers. So the yellow flower and then the really succulent leaves of this one are the giveaway. Vermont has a lot of this. I have not seen this in New Hampshire yet. Coming down here to the water chestnut, This is in New Hampshire in 2 locations. This one is in the Nashua River, and then it's also in the Connecticut River. And it has these big, different looking rosette of leaves that float on the surface. They are anchored to the bottom. They're just not free floating, so they don't move around. But a lot of lake hosts have found the seeds of water chestnut attached to the carpeted bunks of boat trailers. So that's how that one is moving. Luckily, we haven't seen it crop up in any other water bodies yet, but it is one that we're keeping an eye on. And then European frogbit. This one is sort of like the yellow floating heart. It has these really puffy, succulent leaves. They're kind of squishy if you put them between your fingers. And then they have these little white flowers on them. So just remember, if you see the leaves of both of these are about the size of a dollar coin. So they're not big, they're small leaves. And if you feel any that are kind of spongy or thick, those could be the invasives. So really, there are just 3 floating invasive plants to keep an eye on. And then I will talk about African oxygen weed now. This one is not here yet, and it has these really recurved leaves. This is more of a southern invasive right now, but I think with our warming waters in the state, this would really survive nicely in New Hampshire in our summer months. So it is one to keep an eye out for. It can get several feet tall in the water. All right, now truly the submersed plants or the underwater plants. Brittle naiad, this is one that we have seen in New Hampshire, and it has been spreading in the last several years. We have this one in about 6 water bodies right now, in Milton, in Sandown, Hampstead, Derry, those parts of the state. There's also some in Northwood and in Manchester. So it's scattered around. You can see it looks kind of small, and it generally is, but the plant can grow anywhere from about 6 inches to 1.5 feet tall. And the plant is well named. It's brittle. So brittle naiad is a good name for it. It breaks apart. And even though this one breaks apart, we haven't seen it regenerate from the broken off pieces of plant. It instead is a seed producer, and the seeds will drop and will spread this plant. So that is one that is definitely moving and one to look out for. I should mention that this one has a lot of native naiads that look a lot like it, so it's a little tricky to ID. The parrot feather next over is not in New Hampshire. There have been reports of it in small ponds in Massachusetts, and I believe one in Maine. This is in the milfoil family, and it has little divided leaves that circle the main stem. Most of the plant material is above the surface of the water, but there's a whole mass of it underneath that that's underwater, like milfoils typically are. So we're classifying it as an underwater plant, but if the water's shallow, it will come up above the surface. And then, of course, we have the milfoils. I'm going to do variable milfoil first. That one is our biggest, literally the biggest, because it's so tall, maybe 15 feet tall, invasive, but also the most numerous sites with this plant across the state. We're at over 70 water bodies with variable milfoil in New Hampshire right now. And then I'm going to come down here and point out Eurasian water milfoil. That one is in about 6 water bodies in New Hampshire. The difference between the two is the habitat that they like. The variable milfoil likes low pH water, so acidic waters. The Eurasian water milfoil likes higher pH waters, so it's sort of a habitat difference. I can tell you that they coexist in some water bodies that are about neutral pH, so a pH of around 7. So I've seen them coexist in the Nashua River and in parts of the Connecticut River as well. Elodea, that Brazilian Elodea specifically, this is in Nuts Pond in Manchester. So we only have that one location of it. And I think it's been in that pond since 1998. And luckily it hasn't spread, but this plant also has the potential to get really tall and spread very quickly. Coming down here, the Ambulia, This one is not in New Hampshire. It's still a very tropical plant, warm water, high nutrients, but it is a popular one in home water gardens. It is illegal, so they shouldn't be selling it in New Hampshire, but it looks a lot like fanwort that we have in New Hampshire. So it can be kind of tricky to differentiate. The leaves are very similar, fan shaped and whorled around the main stem. The fanwort, which is in the middle here, actually has fan-shaped leaves that are opposite. So if you look closely, you can differentiate, but from the photos, they kind of look a lot alike. And then just a couple more down here on the bottom, we have hydrilla. Luckily, we don't have hydrilla yet. I've been holding my breath for a number of years, waiting for that plant to come into New Hampshire. We are surrounded pretty much. It's in every state around us except for Vermont and New Hampshire. So it is an imminent threat. Both the hydrilla and the elodea look a lot alike, the Brazilian elodea. And then we also have two native elodeas that look similar. So it takes a good eye to really see the differences. My rule of thumb for both of these is that if it's leaves of 3, it's the native. If it's leaves of 4 or more whorled around the stem, it's one of these two invasives. So you got to count the leaves to be sure which is which. And then over here, the curly leaf pondweed is it's a fairly low grower. I am starting to see that one spread into other water bodies in New Hampshire. We have it in about 8 water bodies right now, and it is getting a little denser in those water bodies. It becomes, it forms stands of plants that can be fairly thick. The distinctive factor of this one is that it's got fairly wavy leaves that are about a finger width thick. So it's kind of distinct looking. And then East Indian hygrophila down on the bottom right. This one we don't have in New Hampshire yet. It gets very thick on the bottom. We do have a couple plants that look a lot like this. I did see some in a survey I was doing today, but it was the native. The water purslane or the Ludwigia that we have looks a lot like the hygrophila. So I don't expect you guys to remember all of these, but we are actually working on a pamphlet that we're going to start distributing so that people can start to keep an eye out for these different invasives, just so that we can get a jump on them if they do start to creep up farther north and get into our water bodies. So those are the submerged invasives that are state listed. I do want to take a minute to talk about what I'm calling the new baddie on the block. It is not a state listed invasive yet. I talked about this starting in 2021 in some of the updates that I gave in online presentations. Water violet, also known as Houghtonia palustris, is a European plant. I have no idea how this got into New Hampshire, other than assuming it was brought in through either the internet sale of aquatic plants or through a water garden or home aquarium trade store. So when I first found this, it was in Pickerel Cove on Lake Winnipesaukee in Laconia. And I came across it and I wasn't quite sure what it was. It looks a lot like milfoil, if you see these feather-like leaves here that are kind of whorled. But these are definitely not milfoil flowers. And luckily, when I found the plant, it was in flower. I worked with some botanists to identify it, and we realized that this is only the second location of this plant in the United States. The other location is up in Maine. There was a suspected population in Connecticut, but it was misidentified. So we have, I guess, the distinction or the luck or the unluck of having this in New Hampshire. Now, the problem is last year, I also found it in another cove across from Pickerel Cove in Paugus Bay. And I also found it in a cove on Lake Winnisquam. And we treated one site, dove on the other sites. Things looked really good going into the fall, except the Pickerel Cove site came back really thick. This year, unfortunately, we've confirmed it on Lake Opeechee, which is just downstream from Lake Winnipesaukee, Paugus Bay. So we have a problem on our hands, and we are going to have to start working on containment and research on how to control this plant. The plant was mixed with milfoil in Pickerel Cove, and we treated it last year, and it looked like it held. However, it rebounded. And I think it rebounded because it produces seed and also because the plant acts as sort of an amphibious plant where it can grow in water, but it can grow on moist mud next to the water. And I think some plants hung out in the mud mat and weren't treated effectively and were able to creep back in. So I am definitely worried about this plant in New Hampshire right now. I anticipate that I'm going to list it as prohibited so that it's not sold in the nursery trade and it can't be imported by internet sales, which are really hard to regulate, by the way. But it is a concern. So just take a look at it. Most of the plant material is underwater. It's very feather-like. Instead of the milfoils where you have this straight tubular, it looks like a Christmas garland, this is much more sprawling and messier. It's branching and in feather-like. And then usually at the end of May, early June, it sends up this stalk of whorled violet flowers for a couple of weeks. So if you see anything like this, shoot me some pictures by email and I'll take a look at it and confirm one way or the other. But Lake Winnipesaukee, portions of Lake Winnisquam, a cove on Lake Winnisquam specifically, and now Lake Opeechee have been documented to have these small populations, but they are moving. Waterfowl could also be spreading this one. So this is one to keep on your radar as you're out and about on your water body. So moving on to happier and more interesting news, let's move on to some of the ugly, and you'll notice I crossed that out and put odd looking plants. I don't want to call anything ugly, but there are definitely some odd looking plants that are out there. So let's take a look at a few of those. So the first one is American featherfoil. And for those of you that were listening to me mention the Latin names, Houghtonia, Houghtonia inflata is the rare plant in New Hampshire. The Houghtonia palustris, and I'm just going to purposely jump back 2 slides. Notice these are the same genus. So the plants are in the same family. One of them is not a good plant, which is this one. And then interestingly, this one's a rare plant in New Hampshire. Very hard to find. It also has these little feather-like leaves that cluster, but they sort of cluster in a little rosette at the bottom of these inflated portions of the plant. So these are all air-filled cells that keep this plant floating. And then these just act as sort of a raft for that plant on the surface of the water. I've only seen this twice in my 26 years working for the state and moving around to many of those 1,000 water bodies in the state. So it is truly rare. It's hard to find. There was a lot of it blooming last year in the lower reaches of the Powell River. It's also in a pond in southern New Hampshire. So it's not common and it doesn't bloom every year, but when it does, it's definitely kind of alien looking. So I'm putting this on the odd looking plant list. But again, it's totally fine. It's not invasive. Another unusual looking one, this is mare's tail. I've only seen this once in New Hampshire, and this was up in Pittsburgh. It's this very tall, straight plant, and it's got these little circles of leaves. It almost looks like a horse, horsetail plant, but it's mare's tail. So it's one of those that's out there very rarely. It can get thick in some locations. Interestingly, a little tidbit on this one, it's the most populous plant in Greenland. So it really likes those northern climates. Sort of Arctic areas, but it also survives okay across the northern tier of the United States. So it can do all right. And like I said, it can reach nuisance levels. And where I saw it in Pittsburgh, it was fairly common across the water body, but it's not harmful. Turtlehead. This one is not one that I see very often, but if you look at it, it does sort of look like a turtle's head. The Chelone, which is the genus name of this plant, is turtle in Greek, but it does really look like a turtle's head. The only places that I've seen this are typically along riverbanks, and there are just a couple plants here or there. I don't typically see these in big stands, but it is a truly unique looking plant if you find it. Some of them can be whiter, some of them are pinker. They do tend to like slightly acidic, moist soils, so they're not going to be in the water, they're going to be near the water. And they are a really popular plant for deer to eat. So the deer will probably nip off the top of these plants and it will be hard to see the flowers. Another interesting little tidbit about this, extracts of the plant have been used as birth control for the Abenaki Indians. So it has some interesting medicinal properties to it. So we have a couple carnivorous plants that I'm going to get into. One is the sundew. We do have this in New Hampshire. It likes pretty acidic soils. And what you're looking at here is probably 2 to 3 inches across, and the whole plant is probably with the flower on it, just a couple inches tall. It's not really big. You probably step on it and never know it. You might actually have some on your lake frontages. I typically see it in low pH soils close to lakes. So what these are like little paddle-shaped leaves, and they have all these little sticky hairs that come out. So insects will get stuck to the sticky hairs, and those hairs will actually act as little straws, and it will suck the juices out of the insects and eat them. So it is adapted to be a carnivore in that way. So sundews are kind of neat. And then most people know the pitcher plant. A lot of times you might not know the pitcher plant is there if you don't see the flower, because a lot of times the pitchers can be really low growing or hidden by grasses. But these flower stalks are fairly distinct. So these are the flowers up here, and they're purplish or reddish in color. And then when you come down here, this is a carnivorous part. These cups have reversed hairs. So if an insect falls in, the hairs are pointing down. So it's really hard for the insect to crawl up. And sometimes they'll get tired and they'll fall into the little bath of what looks like water at the bottom of the cup, but it's actually digestive juices. And the insect will break down in those juices and the plant will suck up the nutrients. So just very unique looking type of plants. And these, the flowers on this one are populated, they kind of smell badly. So they are pollinated by flies. And we have the bladderworts. So I get a lot of phone calls and emailed pictures to me saying there are these weird arm-like, wagon wheel-like things on the surface of the water. And what those are just floats. They're just modified parts of the plant that are floats so that this flower for the bladderwort can sit above the surface of the water and get pollinated by insects. So it's just a modification. We have 2 wagon wheel bladderworts in New Hampshire. One is a native. This one on the right is the native, and you'll notice that the little wagon wheel spokes, I guess, are not really bushy in terms of growth on the end of them. If you look over on the left, this one is in some states considered an invasive. We don't have it listed as an invasive in New Hampshire, but notice the difference between the one on the left and the one on the right. Those little spokes are much hairier, I guess, on the left, and that's distinctive of that other more invasive species of bladderwort. So there's a lot more branching and plant material in those whorls than over here on the right. So you will tend to see these. We do have a lot of bladderworts. Many of them don't form this wagon wheel-like growth though, just the radiata and the inflata do. And then this is an invasive. I just talked about this one, but it is odd looking. So I decided to include it. This one, if any of you saw the Sigourney Weaver movie many years ago, Alien, it sort of looks like the alien with all these branching arms coming out in the circular rosette here. If you flip it upside down, it has the little seeds on the underside that fall off and cause the plant to grow again. And then you see all these little swollen portions of the stem, those are just floats so that this rosette sits on the surface. One of my interns that I had in the past, she and I decided that this would make a lovely bouquet for the geeky bride. You might get a little dirty, but they do sort of resemble a rosette or a bouquet. This is what geeky biologists do when we're on the boat doing a lot of survey work. And then a couple more odd looking plants. We do not have giant salvinia in New Hampshire yet. Right now, this is mostly a southern plant, but I put it in here because it is often found in buckets and tubs in garden centers. People put this in their home aquarium, in their water garden. So it is one to look out for. It's this sort of almost folded back on itself type of growth. The leaves are kind of fuzzy and it just floats right on the surface of the water. It's a free floater. Giant salvinia is not yet a concern in New Hampshire, but it could be if our waters continue to warm. Some interesting facts about this plant. It typically likes really nutrient-rich waters that are slow flowing. In developing countries, they actually have considered using this for water purification because it grows super thick on their water bodies and it can take up a lot of metals and nutrients to help purify the water to a degree. And they also have found that extracts of this plant are potentially cancer drugs because it can limit the expansion of cancer cells and not harm healthy cells. So there's been some interesting research done with this plant. We just don't want it in our lakes. Water hyacinth. This one is, again, just like the giant salvinia, popular in the home water garden trade. I have seen this on lakes in New Hampshire where people have placed a couple of plants. Luckily, we still have ice on our lakes in the winter, and this one is not overwintering, but it is only a matter of time before it does. It has these pretty purple flowers, but then it has all these really weird round balls of aerated cells that make the plant float. So it just free floats on the surface. There have actually been cases of this one down in Africa and South America where it gets really thick on the surfaces of waters, causing dam failures because the plant gets really, really heavy. And if you have hundreds of thousands of these, they can cause a lot of infrastructure damage. And then another one, water lettuce. Don't let the name fool you. It is not an edible lettuce. It has calcium oxalate crystals in it, which are not edible. And it also accumulates a lot of heavy metals. So it is not a good plant to have, but it's another one of those that you might find in buckets in water garden stores. It's a potential invasive, just like the water hyacinth and the giant salvinia. They are not currently prohibited in New Hampshire, but they are something that we would probably be prohibiting soon, just based on their movement in industry and also our worry about them overwintering at some point in New Hampshire. And then as we get close on time, I'm going to end with some of the beautiful plants. And this one was tricky too. Beauty truly is in the eye of the beholder. So like I said, you know, a lot of folks may not like the plants in their lake. I know many of you love the plants in your lake and, you know, you sort of use it as a scavenger hunt for what you might find among the plants. This is one of my favorite photos. This is one of my first interns I had back when I first started at DES. She's gone on to get her doctorate in aquatic plant ecology. So she truly loved working with plants and she's working with them now. But she's just paddling around, helping me out with a plant survey and just loving every minute of it while she was interning with me, getting to look at all these plants and the things that she's finding in them, like insects and fish fry and all kinds of neat little things. But how are these plants beautiful? You may see them as colorful or pretty or uniquely shaped. You may enjoy the diversity and the array that's formed by a number of different plants that make up a plant population or community. You may enjoy the habitat that is created by the plants or the overall landscape that these plants create in a portion of the water body. Or you may just enjoy the feeling we get as we explore among the plants in a kayak or some other structure or device that you use to get out on your water body. So looking at some of these really colorful ones, cardinal flower is one of them. This one isn't one that we typically see a lot. It tends to be more along rocky rivers, along the banks of rocky rivers. I do occasionally see it along lake edges though. It is native. The cardinal flower has been used for medicinal purposes topically. So you can make a paste out of it and it's supposed to help with rheumatism and different types of swelling disorders. Some Indian populations have used it for tobacco. They've dried the leaves out and they've used it as tobacco product. Whoops. Same family, Lobelia dortmana or water lobelia. This one is actually an indicator of good water quality. We typically find these in our oligotrophic and some of our mesotrophic lakes. This is sort of one of those plants that doesn't like anything else around it. So you'll probably just find this alone. And there may be small little clusters of this one. It has these really pretty purple flowers and they kind of hang off the stem and nod off the stem. A blue flag iris is a nice little splash of color on the shoreline. We typically have little clusters of these here and there on the shoreline. Buttonbush. This is a really neat plant. It's these little white, very white pom-poms with these really pretty little reproductive structures sticking out of them that give them this little halo. If you like butterflies and hummingbirds, this is a plant to put on your shorefront. It attracts both of those. And it's just a great shoreline shrub to plant. And it's got these really little pretty flowers right about now. When the bushes get mature, they can be covered with these little white pom-pom flowers. We don't see a lot of pink on our lakes. Some lakes across the state have this one. It's pink flowering water smartweed. So it has these little oval leaves on this almost creeping stalk, and then it sends up these little pale pink flowers. We also have white smartweeds with white flowers, but the pink ones are really pretty. And then we also have really common plants that are kind of pretty. Yellow water lily or cow lily has these nice flowers in the spring. It does flower through the summer, but the yellow flower is typically the first one you see on your lakes in the spring. This is one of my favorite photos. I'm coming out of the Pine River on the southern end of Ossipee Lake right here. And you can see Mount Chocorua, you can see Mount Washington, and you can still see the snowfields out Mount Washington, and you can have flowers growing in your lake already. So it's just a nice little juxtaposition. And then of course the white water lily. This one is really pretty and showy. Some of them might have a nice little perfume to them, but most are not, they don't really give off an odor. And then this one is a nice little one that right about now, as it starts to get dark outside, this one almost glows along the shoreline. So if you have swamp candle right along your lake edge, it almost glows yellow right at dusk. It's a native. It just forms little clusters down low, close to shore, and it has these bright yellow flowers, and the plant's probably about 1.5 to 2 feet tall with this little cluster of flowers right at the top. So those are all fairly pretty flowers because of their color or their shape. This one is also very pretty, but I do have a caution on this slide. Pink water lilies are not native to New Hampshire. They are purposely planted, and there is a caution with that. I've read a lot of papers and I've actually seen it myself, where if you buy plants on the internet or you go to a water garden and you buy plants to put in a lake, you are probably going to get more than what you're bargaining for. A lot of these plants have attachments, snails, fish fry, seeds of other plants. So that's why we don't like people planting in lakes because you could be unintentionally planting something else. So while the pink water lily is very pretty, and we do occasionally see it on some water bodies, it is not a native plant. It's pretty, it typically is well behaved, but I have seen places where it has taken over shallows and caused some thick plant growth problems. So on that note, not all pretty plants are good plants, but most of the ones that I showed you just now are all native and all fine. So that is it for my presentation. With that, I am happy to take questions that you might have.
That was great, Amy. Thank you so much. We didn't have a lot of questions in the chat box because I think you did such a great job of explaining what all these plants were. But there is an important one that I do want to bring up that someone asked. And that was talking about the white flower that you found on Winnipesaukee. I can't remember what it was called, but they
Yep.
asked, can volunteers be organized to gather and pull and search the shorelines for this invasive? Same done for other lakes, perhaps done more than once a season. So I thought it would be great if we talked about
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Volunteers are so valuable to us, as you know, at New Hampshire Lakes. You guys are the eyes and ears of our water body, and you do tend to find new infestations early and report them to us. Uh, so please look for these and report them to us, but please try not to manage them yourselves, because if done improperly, and I know it's with the best intentions, but if done improperly, you could be fragmenting the plant, distributing seed, leaving parts behind. So if you let us know about it, then we can have contract divers go in and do the removal for you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Let's see what else maybe we can get in here. We had just some fun comments. Gloria pointed out that Buttonbush is one of our favorites to suggest through the Lake Host or the Lake Smart program. People giving some information about things that they've seen. Valerie said that there's a private pond in Maine, which is filled with that pink water lily. Barbara, our pond has a lot of grass growing in it. It is dense grass. Is dense grass good or bad for the pond?
So if it's a native plant, we don't typically consider it bad for the water body. Grasses tend to hold the soil together a lot better. So if you do have wind and wave action, you're going to have less stirring up of the lake bottom because you have grasses across the bottom. Those grasses also make a really good nursery for fish where they can tuck away and hide from predators. So the grasses are not a problem for an ecological standpoint or even a biological standpoint.
Right. And Joyce is asking if there's somewhere we could get the photos of all these different plants. So we do upload our presentation. So Amy's beautiful slideshow will be available in PDF form on our website. I think there are some other great resources to learn about native plants that you can buy and plant along shorelines here in New Hampshire. And Gloria, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we have access to those through our Lake Smart program. So if you're interested, you could certainly reach out and we can provide them to you if we don't have them easily available on the website already.
Yeah, there's like a 10-page document full
Yeah.
of good shoreline plants. I think it might be in our resource library, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, so definitely reach out if that's something you're looking for. I don't see any other questions, and we are coming up right up on 8 o'clock, but I do want to give a quick shout out to our lake hosts because there have been some saves so far this summer. We've had a water chestnut save on Winnisquam, which was really great. And I'm forgetting now, of course, maybe Amy, you might know, there was one that stood out that was on a lake that didn't have any invasive species in it yet. So that was a particularly great one. I don't know if you remember that off the top of your head.
I want to say it was Eurasian water milfoil sound going into
Was it Crescent Lake?
yes, Crescent Lake in Ackworth.
Yeah, okay. So that was a really great one too. So, and we do have those listed on our website as well. If you go to our Lake Host page, you can see those. So our Lake Hosts are out there doing that great work, even in this hot heat we've been having, checking boats, and doing a good job. Um, let's see, Gloria, were there any other questions that I missed?
There's one that just came in. Kim is wondering what is the best way to manage yellow iris?
The yellow iris can best be managed by hand harvesting it. So if there are flowers or seed pods on it, cut those off and put them in a black plastic trash bag. And then you can dig the plant out and make sure you try to get as much of the root system as possible so that there's nothing that will remain.
Great. Well, we're right here at 8 o'clock. We're gonna let everybody get on with their evening. So Amy, thank you so much. We love having you come and give these talks, and I really appreciate all those beautiful photos. We don't always get those in our webinars, so it's great to see. And I hope you have a great night, and I hope everyone who tuned in has a great night. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Amy.
Bye.
Bye, guys.